Okay, so what we're going to cover today, we are going to talk about what a service line inventory is. Then we're going to talk about how to do a thorough records review. Then Cheryl will come up here and talk about methods that water systems can use to be able to verify what their service line inventories are. And then Bill will come up at the end and walk through the service line inventory form that we put together for operators to use, as well as evidence that we're requiring for water systems to have for those verifications. All right, so why we're here, the lead and copper rule revisions came out at the federal level, which all of you are aware, to address lead contamination in drinking water. So this just strengthens the existing lead and copper rule that's been in effect. 6 new areas to the new rule, 6 key areas. First of all, identifying areas most impacted by lead, and that is the service line inventory. So that's what we're focusing on today. Also, strengthening treatment requirements through additional CCT, systematically replacing lead service lines, increasing sampling reliability, making sure that water systems are actually sampling at the locations they should be, improving risk communication through some additional public education and public notice requirements, and then also protecting children in schools. And this is through new school sampling and child care sampling requirements. So there's a lot that is in the new regulation. This would take days to cover right now. So all we're going to cover today is just the top piece, which is that inventory. But we're kind of in limbo right now. The lead and copper rule revisions came out, but then EPA is working on a new revision to that as well. So that's all this is kind of explaining to water operators that that's happening. But we're training on inventories because we know that that is the one piece that definitely is not going to change. Okay, so the scope of the regulation, in Pennsylvania, there are about 3,000 water systems that are going to have to comply with this regulation. It applies to all community water systems and non-transient, non-community water systems. So that's the same systems that already have to comply with the existing lead and copper rule are going to have to comply with the LCRR and LCRI. Now, it's estimated that there's 160,000 lead service lines in the state of Pennsylvania, but we do think that that's quite a bit of an underestimate. It's based on existing information, which we know a lot of that has holes, missing pieces. We know maybe what's on the water system side, but there's a lot of unknowns on the customer side. So we do think that once water systems start looking, this number is actually probably going to go up by quite a bit. All right, so moving into the service line inventories. Before we talk about what the service line inventories need to include, it's important for us to talk about how a service line is defined. So what is a service line? Per the federal regulation, it is a line which connects the water main to the building inlet, and that may be owned by the water system, by the customer, property owner, or both. So we're not just talking about this water system controlled or owned portion of the service line. So if this is the water main, the larger pipe in the system, service line is the skinny line that goes all the way from the water main into the building. So again, the water system might only own or control a small portion of that. A larger portion might be privately owned, but the entire thing needs to be inventoried when we're talking about these inventories. Okay, so as the federal definition, the federal rule specifies, every water system, non-transients, and communities have to develop an inventory to identify the material of the service lines connected to the public water system distribution. So that's what we're talking about for the rest of this training. So when is this due? Water systems have to have an initial inventory completed by October 16th of 2024. Sounds like that's quite a ways off, but for a lot of water systems, that's really not much time at all. They're large systems, just the sheer number of service lines that they need to inventory is going to be a big challenge. A lot of smaller systems or even large systems might not have great records, which is going to make it very challenging for them to figure out what the service lines are made of. So ultimately, this is going to be a really big undertaking. Don't wait to start this. This is something, if you haven't already started, you need to start on right away to get it completed. Okay, so what do the service line inventories need to include? They must include all service lines connected to the public water system. They have to use existing information to help identify the material of the service line. So that's our records review, which we'll get into more detail. They must categorize each service line. They must include a location identifier for each service line. They must track and identify service line materials as they're encountered during normal operation. They must be updated and they must be publicly accessible. So we're going to spend the next hour or so of this training talking about each of these requirements in more detail. So the first requirement was that it has to include all service lines connected to the public water system, regardless of ownership. Like I said before, it doesn't matter if it's owned by the water system, privately owned by the customer, or some combination of both. So just a reminder of what we're talking about with the service line. We're talking about this entire line going from the water main in. And also in Pennsylvania, we're requiring that water systems not only tell us all the service lines, but also what they're made of. So the material for each service line as well. Okay, so for the second requirement, when developing an inventory, a system shall use any information existing on lead and galvanized iron or steel that's been previously identified. And then the regulation specifies a whole bunch of records that water systems should be looking at. So if available, they should be looking at all construction, plumbing codes, permits, and existing records or documentation, which might indicate what the service line material is. They should be looking at all distribution system maps and drawings, meter installation records, historical capital improvement or master plans, any standard operating procedures that the water system has, which may say that we should always use this type of material when doing line replacements, things like that. Inspections and records of the distribution, and any other source required by the state. So in Pennsylvania's existing lead and copper rule, we do say that water systems should look at existing water quality information when putting together their materials evaluation. So we just are kind of carrying that one over because it's in our current rule. So now I'm going to talk about each of these in more detail and how they can help water systems figure out what the service line material is. The first one was all construction, plumbing codes, permits, and existing records or documentation that indicate service line material. So the reason this is important is because plumbing permits can indicate when structures were renovated. It might indicate if plumbing work was done close to the meter, close to the premise plumbing, or the premise plumbing close to where the water line comes in. There might be notes, documentation of what that service line material is. Also, construction and plumbing codes can be really helpful for water systems. So we are saying in Pennsylvania that if they have legal documents, ordinances, plumbing codes that went into effect prior to the Pennsylvania lead ban, which Cheryl's going to talk more about that, that says that lead cannot be used for service lines after this date, we are allowing that as a standalone method for them to say we do not have a lead service line. So this is going to be a big deal for some systems. There are municipalities out there that have, like, from 1980s on, ordinances saying they cannot use lead. So that could be helpful to them. Municipal tax records are going to be helpful because it will tell water systems when that home was built. So again, if it was built after the Pennsylvania lead ban went into effect, which was in January of 1991, then we know that that should not have a lead service line after that date. And then the existing materials evaluation is something else they can look at. So this is in our existing lead and copper rule in 109, 1103G. The original sample siting plan did require water systems to do a materials evaluation to try to figure out material of service lines and hopefully find the sites that they should be taking their samples out. This is a good place to look, but definitely not the end-all be-all. We do know that materials evaluations, first of all, weren't typically complete, not in all cases. They also weren't updated necessarily, so they might have done one, back in the 90s when they had to, and then never really updated it. So it's a good place to start, but it can't be the only record that they use to identify what their service line material is. All right, the next record to look at are all records, including distribution system maps and drawings. These should, if done correctly, hopefully have pipe size, material, and location specified on them. We're talking any kind of map, hard copy maps, digital maps, web-based mapping. Every water system is something a little different. Data construction lots of times is on these maps, so it'll say, this entire development was built in 1995 or something along those lines. So that could help inform what the material might be and if it's lead. Now, this is another regulation that we have in Pennsylvania. Chapter 109-706 does require every water system to have a distribution system map, and it specifically says that those maps should include the size, location, and construction material of pipes in the distribution system. This is a requirement that is not entirely complied with across the state, but for all water systems that have been able to comply with this so far, they should already have half the information that they need for their inventories just in that distribution system map. So this will be really helpful for some water systems. Others, they might still need to keep digging. Okay, so the next thing they should look at are historical records of each service connection. So we're talking about things like tap cards, ledgers, drill cards. These should have detailed information on them about what the material was that was used, and obviously the location and maybe the size. So this is an example. I believe we got this from the EPA guidance. So this is a pristine example from 1925. The likelihood of water systems having tap cards that look this great from 1925 is probably unique, but we can see from this tap card that 25 feet of half-inch lead pipe was installed. It also indicates the address it was installed and the date, March 18th, 1925. So if a water system digitized their records early on, or they were able to keep really good records and have this information, this is a great place to start. Now, some of the issues with relying solely on tap cards is things change over time. So at this point, this service line's only almost 100 years old. But if good records weren't kept for what changes might have been made, it may or may not be accurate. As I said, a lot of water systems might not even have this information, so they might not be able to rely on it. But for those that do, it's a really good place to start. All right, meter installation records can be helpful for water systems that are out doing any meter maintenance or changing out meters. If good notes were taken, it may contain information on the service line material that was used to connect to on either side. Also, meter size and type can indicate service line size and building usage. So does anybody have any idea why service line size, diameter, might be indicative of whether it's a lead service line or not? That lead service lines typically aren't greater than 2 to 3 inches. So that's accurate. So if you have a service line that's a large diameter going to, let's say, a business park or a high water usage area, 4 inches, let's say, it's definitely not going to be a lead service line. So that could be indicative even if you don't have the material, but you have a large size. Very good. Okay, the next record to review, historical capital improvement or master plans. So these can be helpful because they can document when, let's say, entire service line projects were done in an area. In 1995, we went in and we replaced all of the service lines in this neighborhood, something along those lines. SOPs, I had mentioned that some water systems, and in fact, I was just emailed by a water system last week that said that they had a longstanding SOP from 1985 that says that it has to be copper connected to copper. So they have an SOP that's been in place that said that since 1985, they can't install anything but copper for service lines. So things like that are good records that water systems can use to help identify what the material is. Inspections and records of the distribution system. So this is stuff during normal maintenance that water systems should be looking at when they're out there anyway, looking at things like customer complaints, investigations of leaks, meter issues, cross-connection inspections. All these times are when they're already out in the distribution system and potentially can get eyes on what that service line material is made of. So to kind of kill two birds with one stone, they should be documenting what service lines are when they can. So even right now, we didn't have a very cold winter, so maybe hopefully there weren't as many main breaks as normal, but you know, when during main break season, when there's main breaks, if they have eyes on what the service lines might be because they're fixing a break, that's a great time for them to be documenting what the service lines are as well. And then the very last record for them to look at is, like I said, any other source required by the state. For us in Pennsylvania, we do specify existing water quality information. There isn't a lot that can be super helpful for this, except where they've already had exceedances of lead or copper, which might help indicate, especially with lead, that it's a lead service line. So that would be a good thing for them to look at. All right, so moving on to the third requirement in the inventories is that each service line or portion of the service line where ownership is split must be categorized in the following manner. It either needs to be considered lead, galvanized requiring replacement, non-lead, or lead status unknown. So now I'm going to go over each of these categories and how water systems can figure out which one their line falls into. Lead, pretty straightforward. It's a portion of the pipe is made of lead, which connects the water main to the building inlet. So if any portion of that service line is made of lead, it is considered a lead service line. So if the water system side is made of lead, the customer side is made of lead, any portion, it is considered a lead category service line. Now I do want to talk a little bit about lead goosenecks, pigtails, and connectors. So all of you in the room are probably familiar, but just in case, this is what a lead gooseneck looks like. These are popular to be used by water systems, or were, because lead is pliable. It can easily be kind of bent and twisted how you want it to be able to connect two rigid pipes. So lots of times water systems will find these out there between the water main and the service line, or maybe between two pieces of service line. Another popular one is a lead pigtail. So I'm bringing these up because if they only have a lead connector, and let's say it's connected to copper, that is not going to make it a lead service line. Now it does affect galvanized, we'll talk about that in a little bit, but only having a lead connector is not going to make it a lead service line. So on page 1-8 of the workbook, you don't have to flip to it yet, but this is where this is coming from. We have a chart that kind of walks the water system through how to figure out what category their service line is made of. Our chart is an adaptation, I believe, of the chart that EPA had in their original service line inventory form. We've kind of added some additional stuff to it. But lead, as you can see, is very easy and straightforward. If either half is made of lead, it makes the entire service line a lead service line. Now, one thing I just want to mention is that obviously when it comes to lead service line replacements, if half of it's already been replaced with copper, we're not going to make them replace the whole line, just the portion that's still lead, but the entire line is categorized as lead for the purpose of the inventory. All right, the next one is galvanized requiring replacement. This one isn't quite as straightforward as lead. So before we talk about which galvanized lines need to be replaced, first I want to talk about what a galvanized line is. So a galvanized line is an iron or steel pipe that's been dipped in zinc to prevent corrosion and rusting. So why do we care about them when it comes to lead service lines and inventories? So galvanized lines, there's been a lot of studies done to show that they can be their own source of lead exposure, primarily because galvanized lines capture lead that's been released from upstream pipes, and then it kind of absorbs into the coating inside the galvanized lines and then slowly releases into the home, just like a lead service line would. In addition, the zinc coating that's on galvanized lines up until 2014 could contain up to 1.4% think I have that right. It's a number I always have to look up. 1.4% lead, so even the coating itself has some lead in it. Now this is mostly for when we do trainings in either the South Central or the Northeast, or even Northwest. There were 3 cities in Pennsylvania, Scranton, Indiana, and Reading, that, according to the EPA guidance, in the early 1900s, installed lead-lined galvanized lines. So these poor water systems have a heck of a job to figure out which of their galvanized lines might be lead-lined. This is what a lead-lined galvanized line looks like. It's essentially just a lead line shoved into a galvanized line. So it's going to be very difficult from the outside for them to figure out what that is. The only difference is that the diameter is typically slightly larger than normal galvanized service line, just because it's 2 pipes instead of 1. But those water systems might have a little bit more of a difficult job. All right, so which galvanized lines are we requiring to be replaced? Essentially considered lead. So if it ever was, or is currently, downstream of a lead service line, lead gooseneck, pigtail, or connector, or a service line of unknown material. In Pennsylvania, that is considered a galvanized requiring replacement service line. And if they cannot prove that there was never lead upstream, then it's still considered galvanized requiring replacement, because we don't know what used to be upstream from it. So I do want to talk a little bit about upstream versus downstream, because for other regulations like RTCR, when we say upstream, we're talking about upstream and downstream on the water main. If you have to take check samples because of a positive, you have to go upstream and downstream to get those on the water main. For galvanized requiring replacement, we are only talking about upstream on the service line. So for example, if you have a galvanized line on the customer side, and there is a lead gooseneck or service line, let's say, that had previously been replaced on the water system side, that would be considered a galvanized requiring replacement service line, because it is upstream along the service line going into that home. Another example, galvanized line on the water system side, and there's a lead gooseneck that's still in place between the water main and that galvanized line. That is a source of lead upstream of the galvanized line, so that would be considered galvanized requiring replacement. All right, so this is what the galvanized chart looks like for us. A little bit more complicated, because now we need to take into account if there's lead or lead connectors upstream. All right, the next category is non-lead. So a service line is categorized as non-lead, as non-lead if it has not been categorized as lead or galvanized requiring replacement. But the key here is that they need to categorize it as non-lead through an evidence-based record, method, or technique. So Bill's going to spend some time in his section talking about what evidence we're requiring in Pennsylvania to be able to call a service line non-lead. And you do have to, like I said, because of those mapping requirements, we require water systems to already know the material of their lines. They are going to have to tell us what that service line is made of. So if it's non-lead, you still need to tell us if it's copper or plastic. A galvanized line can be a non-lead line if they know that there was never lead upstream. So then they would just document it as galvanized, but non-lead. So this is what the non-lead chart looks like. And then the last category is lead status unknown. So this one is back to being fairly straightforward, just like lead. If any portion of the service line is unknown, so they don't know it's lead, they don't know it's galvanized, and they don't know if it's copper or, whatever, there's no documentation essentially telling them what that service line is made of, then it would be a lead status unknown service line. And if that's either portion, so we have heard from a lot of water operators that they know exactly what's on their side, but they have no idea what's on the customer side. So until they figure that out, those would be considered unknown lines. Now, water systems may elect to provide more information regarding their unknown lines, as long as the inventory clearly distinguishes unknown service lines from those where material has been verified through record or inspection. So this is what the unknown chart looks like. Again, if either side is made of an unknown material, it makes the whole line unknown until they figure that out. So these are the 4 categories again. To make sure you understood everything I just went through, there's 2 pages, 1-9 and 1-10, that have 7 little photos of service lines. All right, so the first example, we have a lead gooseneck. Use my fancy new pointer. Lead gooseneck followed by a copper pipe. So how would this be categorized? Non-lead, right. Yep, non-lead. You tell us it was made of copper pipe. And just a note, something I forgot to mention earlier. Sorry, the regulation does specify that if lead goosenecks or pigtails or connectors are found during normal operation, they are to be removed. So you can't unearth it and cover it back up. So we do have a place in our inventory template, which Bill will show, where you can indicate if there is a lead connector upstream, so you could document that as well. But you got the category right, it's non-lead. All right, the next one was lead gooseneck, copper pipe, and then a galvanized line. What would this be? Very good. Yep, galvanized requiring replacement, GRR. Okay, next one, copper connector, galvanized pipe, and then a lead gooseneck going into the home. Go ahead. Yes, right. Non-lead. We tried to trick you with the lead gooseneck, but that's downstream of the galvanized line, so that's not a problem. Now, I will say that if you can actually see that lead gooseneck going into the home, it should probably just be removed. But yes, the category would be non-lead. Okay, lead gooseneck, galvanized line, and then a lead pipe. How about this one? Patty K said lead. I agree. This one's kind of confusing because it could also be GRR, but really lead trumps everything. So if there's lead on the line, it's going to be a lead category. Okay, then we have copper connector, copper pipe. This is a partial lead service line replacement, though, in 2016. And then a galvanized line. What would that one be? Right, GRR, because there used to be lead upstream of that galvanized line. Okay, next one is just a straight galvanized line, no connectors. Non-lead, right? Side, what would that one be? Unknown, right. Yep, lead stats unknown because half of it's unknown. So good, you guys have it all figured out. Now I will say, and you'll see this when Bill comes up, that our form, if water systems use it, is a smart form, and it will figure all this out for them. So we have it set up that if they put in the correct information, it will tell them what the category is. All right, well then I'm going to bring Cheryl up here, and we will give you a break in a little while, but she's going to continue on, talk about unknowns.
So those systems with unknowns, and of course, a lot of our systems, by the time that this inventory is due, we are going to have systems that have a lot of unknowns. So the requirement is that after the initial inventory is due, that you will still have to provide updates to the inventory until all the unknowns have been identified in your system, until all the lead service lines and galvanized requiring replacement lines have been in fact replaced, or you have done your non-lead verification of our lines. And Bill's going to get into this a little bit later when we start to talk about our inventory forms, what Pennsylvania is going to be requiring for that non-lead verification. And then, of course, in the reg, you need to identify your unknowns through the normal course of your public water system operations. Anytime you're in there reading meters, main installations or repairs, any replacements, those type of things. And just so you know that all systems with unknown service lines, those unknown lines are treated as though they're lead lines until it's determined that they're not. So all systems with lead service lines or unknown service lines as well must create a lead service line replacement plan. So we're not going to get into this replacement plan. That's going to be a future training down the road. But just so you know, if the system would spur into that replacement of lead service lines, that replacement rate is going to be based on a percentage of lines based off of the number of lead service lines, the number of galvanized requiring replacement lines, plus all of the unknown lines. And then another thing that's brand new with the regulation is that systems are going to have to inform their customers annually that they are served by a lead service line, galvanized replacement, or unknown service line. So providing that notification to consumers on an annual basis of what type of service line they're being fed. Systems with unknown service lines will also require implementing risk mitigation measures after a line disturbance. So that initial additional public notification to that unknown line, if they're in there doing maintenance, replacing the meter, that type of thing, that they need to reduce that level of potential lead source for that homeowner. So flushing and so forth. The other thing, requirement in the reg, is that water systems shall identify and track the service line materials in their inventory as they're encountered. We've already mentioned some things, anytime they're doing, if they can read their meter, if they have meter pits, most of Pennsylvania will probably be in the buildings of the meters. If they don't have remote reads, those type of things, anytime you're doing any maintenance activities. Are in there anytime you have eyes on the material, and like Sabrina had mentioned, any big projects that the system knows that's going to be on coming up, whether it be meter replacements, doing main replacements, any of those big projects, now's the time to get in there and see those service lines and get eyes on the material. Again, mentioning updates to the inventories. Again, after that initial inventory is due on October 16th of 24, it will be required then to be updated on an annual basis. So as systems are replacing lead service lines, as they're uncovering their unknowns, then we will get updated information. This update is also required for the publicly accessible version of the inventory as well. The only systems that, if they initially told us then they would have all non-lead materials in it for their service lines, would not have to do updates unless there comes to a point that they have uncovered that they do in fact have lead lines. And in which case, if they do uncover those lines, they would have to notify the department within 30 days of identifying those particular lines, and then we would come back to them with a deadline of when to have that new and updated inventory to us. And that would be, again, on a case-by-case basis. The service line must be publicly accessible. So for those systems that are greater than 50,000 in population, they would need to make their inventory available online. And for those with less than 50,000 in population, they would just have to provide it to customers upon the request of the customer. For those systems that only have non-lead service lines, they may use a written statement for their public accessible version of their inventory, just stating what information they use to make that determination of non-lead. And then the other requirement is instructions to access the service line inventory. So for those community systems that need to provide a CCR to their customers, they would have to put a statement in that CCR of where they get the service line inventory, where it's located. All right, the seventh requirement is that all service lines in the inventory has to have a location identifier or a unique service line ID. And Bill's going to show you where that is on the inventory form when he gets to the tutorial. So this unique ID is something that would never change. And it's in there so that systems can actually, on the public side, they could have the public version wouldn't have necessarily the addresses written. So it provides somewhat privacy. Now, water systems may choose to use a shortened version of the street address if they would like. That's up to them. So we'll get to that when we get to the inventory form. But for this, you wouldn't want a number that's going to change. So they wouldn't want to use meter numbers, because those could change over time, or account numbers. Those might change over time as well. So that unique ID, we'll take a look at it on the inventory form itself. So then there again, we come back to the inventory itself. It is the building block for all compliance dealing with the lead and copper rule. Okay, so it provides that way to track the progress of lead service line replacements. It provides that communication, that transparency to the customers of what type of service line that they're actually being fed from. And then also it provides us the knowledge of whether or not they're taking their samples from the correct locations. All right, so I have a few questions for you. If you can take a look at your workbook on page 112 and 113. All right, we'll go over these real quick. So which type of systems are required to prepare the service line inventory? We have all of our community systems and our non-transient, non-community systems. Right? Everybody has to comply with lead and copper. So this would eliminate our transient systems. And when's this initial service line inventory due? Right, October 16th of 2024. And then 3 types of information that water system must use to identify the service line materials to prepare their inventory. This is everything that Sabrina had gone over in her first section. So all of those materials, you know, there are tap cards, any records they may have, installation, any inspection records, any historical documents that they might have that would relate to the material type, and our water quality sampling information as well. All right, if the service lines in the water system are split ownership, meaning the water system owns one portion and the customer owns the other portion, would that be considered 1 or 2 service lines in their inventory? What do we think? It is in fact 1 service line. However, the system does need to take into account the material makeup of both portions of that service line in order to properly categorize it. All right, and then which of the following service line are categories under the LCRR? And they are all but C, correct?